I'd like to introduce a friend of mine who I've known for probably almost 40 years as our children grew up together. Brad Frick is a practicing attorney here in Columbus, specializing in civil litigation, including family law, ethics, and sports litigation. Licensed to practice in Ohio and all the federal courts. He's a graduate of The Ohio State University, majoring in both American history and political science. He received his law degree from the University of Notre Dame. He's currently special disciplinary counsel in Ohio, handling possible ethical violations committed by an Ohio Supreme Court justice. So the bar holds him in high esteem. Brad is also
no one else would do it.
Brad is also a 15-year member of UA Rotary. He's married to Diane for about 46 and a half years. They have two sons, Andy, who is a major in the U.S. Marine Corps station in Baltimore, but also working here, and his younger son, Jamie, who also lives in Columbus, and he and his wife have two sons, and Jamie works at Dick's Sporting Goods as a consultant videographer. Finally, Brad, amongst other things he's done, he's been a broadcaster with TAP Broadcasting, Channel 6, QFM 96. He's a frequent speaker at Rotary meetings and at Bar Association legal education seminars, and I can attest to that because I have sat through his seminars where he speaks on ethics, basically. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Brad Frick.
Thanks. Unaccustomed as I am to speaking into microphones, get this one a little closer. Well, good afternoon, Rotary. Good afternoon. Nice to be here. 230 years ago today, James Madison published Federalist Paper number 50. 230 years ago tomorrow, the state of Massachusetts ratified the Constitution as the 6th state of 9 that was required and 13 in total. How we got to February 5 and how we got to that point is what we're going to talk about today. It's a minor miracle, if not a major miracle, and it's something that we should all be proud of. What occurred 230 years ago last September has affected every American since, including all of us, and has had a substantial impact on the world. Let's take this situation in the fall of 1787 and give it some context. So first of all, we know that in 1776, in July, we have the Declaration of Independence. Just 5 years later, we have our first Constitution. That is the Articles of Confederation. 2 years after that, the war is over, 1783. The war is over, and away we go with the Articles of Confederation. What did America look like when this was drafted? You might be surprised. Of the original 13 states, most of them were far larger than every other country on earth. The nation was mostly forest, from the top of Massachusetts to the bottom of Georgia. And it's been said that a squirrel could go from Massachusetts to Georgia and never touch the ground. That's how deeply forested we were back in those days. The West was largely unexplored. As you can see, that map is blank. That map is from the 1790 census. It's blank because it was largely unknown territory at the time, and it didn't belong to us then, and it wouldn't for a while. New York was the size of England. Now, it was larger then because it incorporated a couple of other northeastern states, but it was a large state. The population of the entire country, again, from the bottom of Georgia to the tip of Massachusetts, was just twice the population of central Ohio. You spread us out, even multiplying by 2 between here and northern Massachusetts, and then go south to Georgia, there isn't much there. We were very, very much a small population, large geography country with very small cities. The big three states, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, had 45% of our population. New York City was our largest city. And in 1787, I'd like you to guess how big New York City was. Somebody want to take a guess at the population? How much? 45, 30. Good guesses, actually. I'll give you a hint. There's a suburb in Columbus that's the same size as New York City was in 1787. Right on, Tim. It's Upper Arlington. And the population of New York City in 1787 was 33,000. Arlington a little bit larger. So Boston was much smaller than that. And you can see, although you can't really because it's too small, but again, this is from the census figures from some time ago, 28,000 in Philly, and then you go all the way down to 13,000 in Baltimore. We are a nation that is spread out very thinly with very small cities. 85% of our population was small farmers. 85%. Transportation and communication was a huge challenge. It took 4 days for the mail to go from Boston to Philadelphia. From Boston to Charleston took 10 days by water and weeks over land. To get to Pittsburgh from Philadelphia took a month. And for those of you that may have recently driven on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, it still takes a month. A 1787 tweet from London to New York took 7 to 8 weeks, and they called it a letter back then. There were no political parties in 1787, and there wouldn't be for another 13 years. We were all Americans. We were Federalists and we were anti-Federalists, but for the most part, we were all Americans. There was no standing army at this time and under the Articles. Standing army was thought to be a tool of tyranny and something that nobody really wanted. There were huge international problems. The British were supposed to vacate the country in 1783 under the Treaty of Paris, but what they did was run up to the Great Lakes, and they occupied a good portion of that yellow section up there by the Great Lakes. They didn't leave the continent. And of course, they were in Canada. The Spanish controlled the Mississippi and Florida, and they closed the Mississippi to shipping for Americans. It was very hard for us to do commerce in the West. And the Barbary pirates were stealing American ships in the Mediterranean and enslaving the crews. We had a number of international problems. The Articles of Confederation weren't any help. It's probably best remembered for all the things it didn't have. So let's talk about that. It did not have two houses of government. It did not have a House of Representatives or a Senate, for example. It was a unicameral legislature, one body. There was no executive. There was no president. There was no one in charge. Now, I'm going to venture a guess that you couldn't run this club without a president. Can you imagine running a country? But we did that for about 8 years. Very, very difficult. There was no taxing authority, so the central government had no money. It was unable to pay its debts. It couldn't pay its Revolutionary War veterans. It couldn't do anything, really. There was no maritime powers, so we couldn't regulate commerce. The highways and freeways of the day were rivers and water, and there was no way to regulate that at the federal level. There were no commerce powers. There were no federal courts. Think of this as the European Union. These were 13 countries, essentially, that were bound together by a treaty, not really a constitution. The taxing power was a real problem because the nation was chronically underfunded, couldn't pay its Revolutionary War veterans for their service, couldn't pay for the nation's defense. Debt was a huge issue. Debt was a bigger issue then than it is now. It was crushing debt that resulted in a lot of foreclosures, and we had debtors' prisons then. The fact that there were no courts meant there was no judicial review, so if there was a problem with a statute under the Articles, there was no way really to have it litigated. There were disputes between states, and they couldn't be resolved in the court system because there wasn't a system for it to be resolved. As a result, there were skirmishes and border wars. There were shots fired. There were problems between the states. You couldn't ship your goods from New Jersey to New York without paying a tariff or a tax. It was a completely dysfunctional system. You couldn't amend the Articles of Confederation without a unanimous vote of all 13 states. Want to guess how many amendments there were? None. That's right. There were interstate tariffs, there were border wars, there were riparian rights issues, who owns the river, who gets to charge for the river. And most importantly, each state had a vote called per-state voting. So that meant that Delaware and New Hampshire and Rhode Island were just as powerful under this Constitution as Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. That created an enormous difficulty that we had difficulty overcoming, but ultimately we did. This whole situation I just recited to you was really an overreaction to the British and what the British did to us. We didn't want a standing army. We didn't want any strong figures like the king. We didn't want colonial governors. We just had it with them, and as a result, we overreacted. Now, the international pressure plus the problems at home led retired George Washington to call a conference at his home in 1785. As a result, in 1786, there was a meeting in Annapolis, and that meeting was supposed to have been attended by all of the state's representatives, but very few showed up. Then in January of 1787, Shays' Rebellion occurred. Shay and about 2,500 Revolutionary War veterans marched on an armory in Massachusetts in order to get arms because they were, first, not paid for their service. Secondly, they were having their farms foreclosed on because they couldn't pay their bills. Thirdly, they were going to debtors' prisons. This was deemed to be totally unacceptable, and it scared the bejesus out of Washington. He knew that this was totally unacceptable. They were his guys. They had marched with him. And the fact that we hadn't paid them created this kind of difficulty, and now Americans shooting Americans, totally unacceptable to Washington. So in February of 1787, right after Shays' Rebellion, the Continental Congress decided that it would have a convention. And the convention would convene in May of 1787 in Philadelphia with the purpose of amending the Articles. Excuse me. But there were a number of delegates who had other ideas. Washington, Madison, Hamilton, three of them at the top, but there were a lot more, wanted to do a heck of a lot more than just amend this dysfunctional document. So, in May of 1787, we finally got a quorum at the end of the month, and they met here at the Pennsylvania State House, now known as Independence Hall, and they met in the hottest summer in 37 years. And there wasn't any air conditioning, and there weren't any fans. They even closed all of the doors and windows to the outside and posted a guard. They wore wool suits, and there was no deodorant. This was a really tough situation. They locked themselves in a 40 by 40 room, that one right there, which is a fraction of the size of this room, and locked themselves in for 3 months. Interestingly, though, there wasn't a leak. How very quaint. There wasn't one leak in this 3-month period. So let's talk about who was there. 12 of the 13 states were represented. Rhode Island didn't show up. Here are the delegates. 55 white males. All were Protestant, but 2 Catholics and a handful of Quakers. The age range was 26, young Jonathan Dayton, who, by the way, yes, Dayton is named after him, and the oldest was Benjamin Franklin at 81. The average age of the convention attendee was 43. 2 of the delegates were small, self-made farmers, but 85% of the population were small farmers. This was a meeting really of America's elites. 31 of the 55 that attended were trained in law. A quarter of them were large commercial farmers or plantation owners. All of them held public office. All were known in their states. 7 were governors or former governors. 8 were judges. 42 had been congressmen. 8 were signers of the Declaration of Independence. 30 had seen service in the Revolution. 15 saw serious action, and several of those were war heroes. A quarter of the attendees, like Washington and Franklin, had national reputations. 20% of the signers of the Constitution were immigrants. Somebody want to call Washington on that? When Jefferson found out who all was attending, he described them as demigods. He was nowhere near. He was the ambassador to Paris. John Adams was the ambassador to London. Washington was 55 years old, 55, and was 6'3" or 6'4", depending on who you ask. Historians have trouble with height for some reason, but he clearly commanded a presence. He was internationally known. He commanded a revolution that beat the strongest empire in the world, and everybody knew who he was. He was unanimously elected president of the convention. But the intellectual powerhouse for what occurred at this convention was 5'2" James Madison, who, along with Washington and the other Virginians, created the Virginia Plan that ultimately was the blueprint that was used at the convention to give us what we have today. Madison was skilled and a student of Roman and Greek and English history. He was an intellectual. He was not a lawyer. He never had a job. He was lucky enough to be born into a good situation in Virginia, but he devoted his entire lifetime, 85 years, to public service. The Pennsylvania delegation immediately threw in with Madison. Hamilton attended, but only occasionally. He did a lot more before the convention and a lot after, but his convention record's spotty and not so good. In fact, he gave the worst speech of his life at the convention and had trouble living it down for years. Basically, he endorsed the British system and liked the idea of a president for life. Thank you. I'm allergic to winter. Yeah. This convention occurred in that room in complete secrecy. The only attempted leak was somebody left some notes outside the door. Washington found them, that berated the rest of them, and that was the end of that. There were 2 note takers, James Madison and a fellow named Jackson. There were 4 major issues that they confronted, and all 4 of these could have derailed the convention, derailed the Constitution, and ruined what we have today, because it's a certainty that we would not have one country as we do today. Here are those 4 issues. The first is representation, how to be represented. Remember I said a minute ago that every state had a vote? That meant the small states were empowered. They were a lot more powerful than the large states, because with just a few folks, you had just the same vote as you would in the entire state of Virginia. So the small states didn't want to give up the power. The big states would have none of that. There would be no further discussion if we had a per-state vote. So a guy named Roger Sherman from Connecticut, who also spent a lifetime in service, suggested that we do this. Let's have a lower house with proportional representation based on population, and an upper house, kind of like the British model, where we have equal representation. And as we all know, that's ultimately what happened: proportionate and per-state representation. This was a compromise to get the big states and the small states on the same page. Now, there was a problem with this in the southern states, particularly South Carolina, because South Carolina wanted all of its slaves to be counted as population, but refused to give any of them any rights whatsoever, either civil or human rights. So there was a very long discussion about this, and it nearly broke the convention. But the compromise that Connecticut put on the table is the one that carried the day, and ultimately we end up with the legislature that we have now. The Senate was the next battleground. How to choose senators. How many would there be? Obviously, we ended up with 2. But to get there, there was a lot of discussion about the indirect election of senators. Could the people be chosen? Could the people be trusted to choose senators? It was thought that they would not. It was thought that this would be kind of an upper chamber, kind of an elitist organization, and therefore they decided that the state legislatures should determine who the senators would be. This, of course, preserved what in essence is a ruling class. The third issue was the executive. How to have an executive that was strong enough to lead, but not too strong to become tyrannical. This was a very difficult and delicate situation. They debated this for weeks. What they ultimately decided was that we could make the executive a co-equal branch of government with the legislature, provided that the judges are divorced from the executive branch. Remember, under the Crown, all of the judges in our country were paid by the Crown, and they could be hired and fired by the Crown. And our forefathers determined that that's a very bad deal. And as a result, we'll have judges, but they will not be part of the executive branch. And now what do we have? 3 branches. The next brilliant move then was how to balance their power. And it was ultimately decided that the way to do this is to give everybody co-equal branch, give everybody certain powers, including checks and balances on the other branches of government. How to choose the executive, which was called the executive then. It wouldn't be the president until the end of this summer. But they talked about state legislatures, they talked about the federal legislature, they talked about the governors, they talked about direct election, although they didn't give the people much credit. And part of that is because what I mentioned earlier about communication and transportation. If you're getting your newspapers 7 and 8 weeks late, or even a few weeks late, it's hard to keep up with what is going on. And as a result, they thought it made more sense to have certain educated electors in each state meet, and they would determine who the president and vice president would be. That became the electoral system. It's in place because of the situation we had in this country in the 18th century, and it's there primarily because we didn't have the communication or transportation infrastructure to allow us to make intelligent decisions. At least that's what the convention thought. So we've got Rube Goldberg and the electoral system that's only 230 years out of date, and that's why we have situations like the election of 2016, 2000, 1888, 1876, where you have minority presidents, those that won the popular vote but didn't end up as president. The fourth and most contentious and difficult issue at the convention was slavery. It was always the elephant in the room. The southern states, though surprisingly not all the Virginians, were not in favor of giving up their slaves. It was a deal breaker. If you want a new country and you want a new constitution, our slaves have to be part of this, and we have to count them for representation. The 3/5 compromise was ultimately adopted so that slaves were counted as 3/5 of humans for the purpose of representation and given no other rights whatsoever. This greatly skewed the voting in the early days to the southern states because very few or many fewer voters actually were free. This laid the foundation for what happened in 1860. There were also the issues of what to do with fugitive slaves, what to do with the slave trade. Those issues took weeks again to unravel. And the bottom line on this is a simple one. If there was going to be a country, the South demanded, led by South Carolina, demanded that the slaves be treated the way they wanted them to be treated. The trade-off and compromise was that the new states that would be admitted, other than Kentucky and Tennessee, which were on the verge of statehood, would be admitted as free in the Northwest, while states below the Mason-Dixon line would be admitted as slave states. And they instituted into the document itself that the Congress would revisit slavery in 1808, and then it could, that's 20 years, and then it could determine whether or not the importation of slaves would continue. Congress ultimately did look at this in 1808, and that is the year that the importation of slaves ended. So they did end at least the importation of it, but it took 20 years, And it took that compromise in order to have the Constitution that we have. Surprisingly, there was very little talk about commercial issues and the regulation of economic power and commerce. That is because they made a decision very early on that this Constitution would be the first NAFTA. Now, you just heard that for the first time, but if you because I made it up. But if you think about it, it's exactly what happened. They decided that there ought to be free trade and no tariffs and no problems whatsoever in crossing a state border. No tariffs, no taxes, free trade. It was truly the first North American Free Trade Association, and it's the United States Constitution. All right, here's some serious omissions from our Constitution. The Bill of Rights. There are 4 competing theories as to why there was no Bill of Rights in 1787. It does come along in 1791. But the 4 theories are interesting. First of all, the Southerners did not want it. The slave states didn't want to have to deal with the freedoms that go with the Bill of Rights because a substantial portion of the population, 40% in some places, were not free. Most of the states already had a Bill of Rights. There was a theory that if you have an enumerated Bill of Rights, that may be all you get, and therefore you couldn't expand from there. So it might be limiting, actually. But here's the 4th theory, and I think it's the one that's right. They were just plain tired. They had been living together and working together in a very small room for 3 months. Hot every day. They took Sunday off. There was a 5-day break in there, but they just had to get back to work, get back to their families, and get back to running the country. They just got tired. I think that's the reason there wasn't initially a Bill of Rights. Judicial review is not in the Constitution. That's an omission. However, in 1803, Marbury versus Madison occurred, and argued, by the way, by one of the members of the convention named James Wilson, a great trial lawyer, argued the Marbury versus Madison case, and that gave us judicial review. So ironically, when you hear the term unconstitutional, you can remember that judicial review is unconstitutional. It only got decided years later through Marbury versus Madison and another Judiciary Act. And of course the omission of not abolishing slavery, which I think was a terrible mistake. Anyway, although if you want a country, you had to live with the Southern terms at the time. So the signing of the Constitution comes along, and I think the way to look at this is a beautiful study in compromise and communication. Virtually every word in that Constitution is a compromise. And if you get a chance to read it again, and you should, it's not very long, it's easy to read, take a look at it, because virtually everything there is a compromise of some kind. The brilliance of the document is the separation of powers, and how we have 3 competing branches that have checks and balances on the other. Tested today, perhaps more than ever before. It will be interesting to see if our 18th century founders created a document that's solid enough to handle today's challenges. They did all of this in 90 days. Now, normally in a legislature, whether it's the one over there or the one in Washington, they can't get you a rough draft in 90 days. These guys did all of this in 3 months. Now we have a separate independent statewide government, and we've got a federal government overseeing and taking care of our health, safety, and welfare. It was adopted and signed September 17th of 1787, and immediately the Federalist Papers were initiated. There were 85 of them, written by Hamilton, 50, Madison, 30, John Jay, who was the first Supreme Court Justice. It wasn't John Marshall. It was John Jay. He's on the right. Those 3 wrote the Federalist Papers. What were they? Well, today what we would say was they were a marketing tool, because they were drafted to sell all of the states, but specifically New York, into agreeing. The New York delegation walked out. Hamilton was only there a third of the time, and the other 2 just left. Hamilton's the only one that signed it. Now, I don't know, maybe they set a precedent for New York politicians going back home. But of course, it has been 230 years. That's an old. So the states, 9 of the states ratified them in June of '88, and then all the states, all 13, by May of 1790, signed on. Rhode Island again being the last. So that is the story of the Constitutional Convention. Do we have any questions? Yes.
I noticed the Articles of Confederation the title was Perpetual Union. Is there anything similar to that? I don't think there was anything in the Constitution.
There is not. The question was, I'll repeat it, yeah. The question on the perpetual union line that you saw, good question, on the Articles, is there anything in the Constitution? No, there isn't. And I'll tell you, perpetual was off their radar screen. They were all terrified, first of all, that they exceeded their authority. They were supposed to modify the document, not create a new government. And then they were very concerned that it would not get ratified. And so perpetual is not something they had in mind. Questions? Others? Yes, please.
What were the precedents of bicameral legislature? Were there any precedents they were looking at?
Yes. Yes. Was there precedent for bicameral? Yes, there were. In many of the states had bicameral, and the British did. Remember, we're mostly British here. In fact, many of the immigrants that were here were also British subjects. So that form was pretty well known to us, but they didn't like the strength of the executive, the crown.
So
Yeah, Steve?
they elected a president before the last state ratified the Constitution?
You know, I don't remember exactly. I think that's right, because I think Washington started in 1789.
89, right.
That's right. I think so, Steve. That's a good question. By the way, the role model for president was Washington, and he's sitting up there in the middle of all of this. And they all had him in mind while they're drafting Article 2 of the Constitution. It was drafted essentially for Washington. Other questions?
Yes. Senator Paul.
Yes, thank you. What's your take on the indigenous people that lived in the U.S. at this time? Your map showed, like, extended into the Ohio territory and Michigan, and are there some presumptions on your map that those lands actually belong to the United States?
Oh, wow, that's a good question.
The question's about indigenous native population and where they fit into this, and I think the answer is they ignored them. I think our two blackest marks in our history are slavery and the way we treated the folks that lived here. And while they did address the slave situation to some extent, they totally ignored the native population. Yes, in back. Scott, is that you?
No.
Can't see, sorry. David?
I've heard George Washington was like, you know, people tried to convince him to become a king or maybe a president and not have any term. Could you just comment on his actions or his attitude?
Yes, that is true. You heard correctly. In fact, Hamilton would have him serve for life if he could have. Hamilton was a captain, an artillery captain, and his aide for many years. They were very close. I don't think there was any serious discussion about lifetime appointments or even Washington, who was very tired and just wanted to go home and retire. In fact, they had to really beg him to become president. The poor guy never got a break. He's either shot at or yelled at virtually his whole life. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, that's the question.
Yes, over there. I can't see you, but I see hands.
To your knowledge, has there been any other constitution that's lasted as long or been written
No.
in the world?
No, we are the oldest and longest, although there is a claim in the Western Hemisphere to the Dominican Republic, I think, claims to have an older democracy, but there's nothing like this. We are unique.
Yes.
I'm not a historian, but I do understand that if enough of the states aggregate their interests together, there's some retribution or ability to change some of the principles that the Constitution outlined. I don't know how to refer to it intellectually, but I think you probably know what I'm talking about.
Amendments is what you're talking about. How to change it? Yes, the Congress can do it. There are conventions that can do it. It's been amended 27 times. The first 12 were amended very soon after this was adopted. I don't remember exactly how all of them were, but I think most of them were adopted through the Congress.
Okay. Yes.
To discuss a little bit more of the Constitution, the fact that it's lasted this long, are the amendments, or what do you think the makeup is that's been able to maintain this governing body element whole for this period of time? And right now, obviously, I think we're under a lot of tests with that. Can you address?
How have we done this for 230 years? How has it
Yeah.
lasted?
And if we have a moment, we'll talk about the assault on the Constitution. I think it's a tribute to American people who, even in those days, were very independent and wanted to live free. It embraced capitalism, which I think helped things grow. Markets do work. They can be cruel and brutal, but they do work. And I think the fact that we were a capitalist nation with a desire to live free as possible, plus we learned pretty hard early on how to defend ourselves because we were not ready. Winning that revolution was a miracle. This was at least thought through, but that was a miracle. And then 1812 presented additional difficulty. And we really stayed out of international problems, though, after 1812. And you may know that Teddy Roosevelt, who was one of our strongest leaders, not a shot fired during his presidency. And I'm not sure there were any shots fired from 1812 to the Spanish-American War in 1898. So strong, powerful. It's a big nation. It's not one that you can just roll through like a blitzkrieg through Poland. And as for today's situation, the Constitution and a lot of our institutions are being challenged. But I think with 230 years of history, they will be just fine. If there's anything that I worry about with the present administration, it's pushing the button down. Because I think military action is something we should be concerned about, because this president knows that his numbers will go up if he uses the military. If he's struggling before the 2020 election, look for something to happen. But in terms of our domestic institutions, I think we are so solid, so strong, and so tough that nobody is going to impact them in the long run. Yes, in the short run, not wrong. Yes?
Yes, I might argue that it's failing in terms of availability of deadly weapons in America. We have a deadly weapon death rate, some huge multiple of any place else, primarily because the weapons are easily at hand. How does that fit with a 230-year-old document?
Well, the Second Amendment's another talk, and that will take longer than 25 minutes. There is only one unsolvable problem in our country, just one unsolvable problem, and that is gun violence. It is not solvable. If we don't have the fortitude to keep people on the no-fly list from buying a gun, we have no fortitude. You allow Sandy Hook in Las Vegas and do absolutely nothing about it, that's a problem. But we all like our Second Amendment rights. Many folks in this room, a majority I'm going to guess, have weapons at home and want to keep them there. This is we're not going to take them away. This is an unsolvable problem. It's the only one. You can solve a drug problem, but you can't solve that.
Last question. Rick?
Could you confirm something that I've read several places, and that is that Jack Graff covered the Constitution's
Yes.
Rick, thank you. He was sitting to Madison's right, which, by the way, puts me there too, because we went to high school together.
Thank you very much, Brad. We appreciate that. Come again next week, everybody, and be sure to bring your sunglasses and the SPF, because we're going to have a day at the beach. We're going to be serenaded by the Franklinton Prep Academy Steel Drum Band. We're going to have a special menu, And we're going to hear from Jay Casey, who's with Ohio State. He's going to talk about the stewardship of their physical facilities there on campus. So come back. We'd love to see you again.